Hello, folks, and welcome to another edition of Zog Science. Today, we're going to be talking about human genetic conditions, or when good genes go bad. Now, before we get into that, we're going to need to talk about pedigrees. Pedigrees are charts that are used to help track genetic traits over multiple generations. Pedigrees only track one trait, so we can only look at one thing at a time, and we're going to have different kind of patterns of inheritance that are going to be displayed for different traits. And this is just kind of a key for what this is going to look like. So we've got our males, which are squares, females are circles. If it is affected, so if the trait that we're looking at is present, then that will be a dark circled in. It'll be colored in. If a mating occurs, so then we will have a horizontal line, and then the offspring will come off of that, so there'd be a line coming down, and then these would be all of our offspring, and birth order goes from left to right, so the oldest going to the youngest. So if we take a look at this one, right, there are four kind of questions that we need, or two questions that we need to figure out. Is it autosomal, sex-linked? Is it dominant or recessive? Okay. The way we can figure out if it is autosomal or sex-linked is we will see if there is a higher prevalence in males than females, right? Sex-linked traits are generally going to be on the X chromosome, so they are going to be a higher percentage of males that have the trait. We also, if we want to see if it's dominant or recessive, are going to look and see, does it skip a generation, right? Dominant traits are always going to show up in every generation, provided that we have enough offspring, whereas recessive traits are going to skip generations, right? Because sometimes they can be hidden. So in this case, this would be a autosomal recessive trait. We actually have more females that have it than males, and it skips a generation here, meaning that this female did not receive the proper thing, so it is going to be the allele that is necessary. So let's take a look at some dominant autosomal traits, or we're going to look at one particular disease in general, but this is the dominance or the inheritance pattern for a dominant autosomal trait. We've got every generation showing up with the widow's peak. So Huntingtons. Huntingtons is a pretty tough disease. It is a degenerative disease of the nervous system, and it has a lethal dominant allele in the HTT gene, which codes for the protein Huntington. So you can kind of see where the name of the gene came from, and specifically they were looking for the gene that was coding for this disease. And what happens is that the normal allele has approximately 10 to 35 repeats of the CAG sequence. So this is like a triple nucleotide sequence. However, the mutant allele has between 36 and 120 repeats, which causes abnormally long protein. The Huntington protein is abnormally long. That protein then accumulates in neurons, which leads to the neurons malfunctioning. And so this is why this is kind of a degenerative disease. It takes a little while for these proteins to kind of to accumulate enough. Now, what makes this disease particularly problematic is that you can't, or rather, you don't. There's no like physical expression of this. There's no way to just look at a person and say, "Hey, you've got Huntington's." In fact, the symptoms don't even show up until people are 35 to 45 years old. And since this is a dominant disease, what that means is that most of the time people would have had children at this point, potentially passing it on to their children, which is one of the reasons why it has been able to survive for such a long time, even though it is, it kills people. Because people don't exhibit the symptoms and don't die until they're, into their 30s and 40s, you still have an opportunity to reproduce and pass it along. Now, you can diagnose this using genetic testing, and the problem then is that you've got like this, this kind of quandary, right? Do you want to know that you could potentially die, right? Or would you rather know that way you can plan and make sure hey, I'm not going to have kids, or maybe you do some sort of genetic screening to on embryos and maybe go through in vitro fertilization. So definitely some ethical issues that go along with Huntington's, and just because of the kind of the way that it manifests itself. We also have recessive autosomal, right? Recessive autosomal traits are generally going to skip some generations. An example would be attached earlobes or free earlobes. And you can kind of see that on yourself, see whether or not you have attached or free earlobes. You can kind of look and see how they move through and you can actually trace your own family's ancestry and see whether or not your grandparents or cousins or whatever, whether or not they have attached or free earlobes, and you can make your own little pedigree of your family. So cystic fibrosis is a autosomal recessive, and it is the most common lethal genetic disease in the United States. It is a recessive mutation in the allele of the CFTR gene, and the CFTR gene provides instructions for making a channel that transports chloride ions into and out of the cells. And why that's important? Well, the chloride channels help to maintain correct amount of water. They also are necessary for the production of mucus, and mucus is used in a lot of different places. It's not just in your nasal passages. It's also used in your throat and your stomach linings in order to help just maintain a certain amount of fluidity. And so what happens is that the mutation codes for chloride channels that malfunction and they don't work well, and because of that, mucus gets produced that is unusually thick and sticky, and that tends to clog airways and various ducts in the body, which causes the symptoms of cystic fibrosis, which include poor absorption of nutrients, chronic bronchitis, and recurrent bacterial infections. The reason why people have poor absorption of nutrients is that your stomach lining, again, there's kind of a mucus that is secreted inside. That mucus gets in the way, doesn't allow you to absorb nutrients particularly well. Bronchitis, right? You're going to have problems with your lungs because, again, there's mucus that is secreted in your lungs. The reason why is that your lungs need to be moist at all times in order to function properly to allow gas exchange to occur. However, the mucus is too thick, so it doesn't really allow you to get enough air, but you also get infections, right? So not very good. It is much more common in those of Caucasian descent. So we know that it evolved sometime after humans left Africa, just because there's again a higher rate of that in those of Caucasian descent. It could have, I guess, evolved before that, and then kind of gotten expanded in those of Caucasian descent rather than those of maybe African or Asian descent. We also have sickle cell disease. This is another autosomal recessive mutation. This type is in the HBB gene. This is the most common inherited disorder for people of African descent, and it codes for beta globin. The gene HBB codes for beta globin, which is a part of hemoglobin. It's one of the subunits. Hemoglobin is made up of 4 subunits, 2 beta globins and 2 alpha globins. And so this is a mutation that occurs in the beta globin. And what happens is that the abnormal beta globin, when it is coded for by the mutation, causes the hemoglobin to clump together, forcing the red blood cells into a sickle shape. Now, it's not like this all the time, but it can happen. It can be triggered to occur. These sickle-shaped shells tend to die prematurely, even those that haven't become sickle-shaped, but just in general, they tend to die a little prematurely. So what that does is that decreases the amount of blood cells that you have in your body, leading to the anemia. They can also get stuck together, and they can get stuck inside little blood vessels throughout your body, which is going to be very painful. And they also inefficiently carry oxygen. They aren't unable to carry out their function as well as they should be able to, which again is going to be part of the problem, right? So characteristics of the disorder, again, low number of blood cells, which is known as anemia. You have a lot of infections and periodic episodes of pain. Now, one of the more interesting things about sickle cell anemia is that those that are carriers or those that have the disease have a resistance to the malaria pathogen, okay? Malaria is caused by a plasmodium, which is a protist, and that protist has a hard time attacking blood cells that have this beta globin in it. That is what malaria attacks, is your blood cells. So this is the reason why it has become a very common thing in those of African descent, is because the sickle cell gene provides an evolutionary benefit, right? Having that sickle cell is a benefit, especially if you just are a carrier, okay? Because in Africa there are a lot of places where malaria is present, it's useful to have that resistance to it. So that's the reason why it has kind of been able to stick around again and kind of build up in a higher frequency in those of African descent than those of maybe Caucasian descent. We can also have sex-linked diseases. Sex-linked diseases are far more common in men. So when we look at a pedigree, we would be seeing it much more often in men than in women. And they tend to skip generations because most of the time they're going to be recessive. There are X-linked dominant traits and there are Y-linked traits. Those are just far less common. So most of the time you're going to see X-linked recessive disorders. And an example of an X-linked recessive disorder would be hemophilia. It's a fairly common blood clotting disorder. It is an X-linked recessive mutation in either the F8 or the F9 genes. And the F8 or F9 genes, they code for coagulating factors 8 and 9, which aid in blood clotting. So there are a lot of these factors that work together in order to initiate blood clotting. If there's a mutation in either one of them, then you are going to have some problems. Because it is recessive, you do need mutations in both of them, right? So you need to have either 8 or 9 completely wiped out. However, those that are carriers are at risk for some amount of abnormal bleeding. Okay. So the problem was that if you don't have your coagulating factors, your blood will not clot. So even a simple cut will just continue to bleed and bleed and bleed, and it will never really stop. Or rather, it will eventually stop, but it takes a really long time for it to. So that can be a big problem, especially if you're a member of like the royal family, right? And you are, supposed to be kind of a leader. That could certainly be a problem. This was famously, again, found in European royal families. Treatment involves doses of coagulation factors after injuries. That's rather a kind of a newer thing, probably in the last 30 years or so that they've actually been able to figure out how to make that happen. So this is the famous royal pedigree. Particularly, it basically involves all of the royal families in Europe. So Victoria, Queen Victoria of England, was a carrier for hemophilia, and so she passed that along. And then because all the royal families tend to intermarry a little bit, it got spread out throughout the entirety of Europe. So kind of an interesting story, a good look at the different, or I guess a real life example. You can definitely see how there are many more hemophiliac males than there are females. In fact, there are no females who are hemophiliacs. They are all just carriers. Now, male pattern baldness, this one's a little bit more lighthearted than the other ones. It's also known as androgenic alopecia, and it occurs in both men and women, although it's obviously much more common in men because it is a mutation in the AR gene, which is located on the X chromosome. Now, it's unclear exactly how the disruption of the AR gene leads to baldness, although they do believe that there are environmental factors that can play a role. Now, let's talk just briefly about how hair growth occurs. So hair growth begins under the skin in structures called follicles, and each strand of hair normally grows for about 2 to 6 years. So kind of a long time, then goes into a resting phase for several months, and then it falls out. So that's kind of the natural cycle of your hair. Your hair actually kind of sticks around for a while. The hair growth will then restart after it falls out. However, if there is a mutation in the AR gene, it tends to what happens, I guess, is that it tends to increase the activity of the androgen receptors, and the high levels of androgen have been associated with hair loss. So again, they're not exactly sure how that works, but they are kind of working it out. So kind of an interesting thing. So finally, inbreeding. Inbreeding is a bad idea, mostly because what happens is that recessive traits can be compounded over time. So what happens is that you've got, some individuals that have some recessive traits, right? These recessive traits generally are not, a problem because they're all hidden. However, when you continue to interbreed, right, it is more likely that a person who is a carrier or heterozygous for a trait will mate with someone who is also heterozygous for a trait, thereby leading to now have offspring that are homozygous for that recessive trait. A lot of times, recessive traits are what cause disease, because most of the time, or not necessarily most of the time, but a good portion of the time, recessive traits tend to have problems associated with them because we don't really see them a lot in the population. So that's the reason why inbreeding is a bad idea. And that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.